Back when my wife and I were still dating, we had been together for a couple of years. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she told me she wanted to take a break and see other people. She hinted that maybe we could reconnect in the future. Her decision left me heartbroken. While she went out and started dating other men, I couldn't bring myself to move on. I buried myself in my work, clinging to the hope that she would eventually come back. She had always said she wanted to wait until marriage for intimacy, and I believed she still wanted that future with me. But life had other plans. A year passed, and I found out she had moved on, not just emotionally but physically, with the man she left me for. It was a crushing realization. Later, when that relationship fell apart due to his dishonesty, she reached out to me again. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. The pain she had caused was still too fresh. Eventually, they gave their relationship another shot, but it didn't last long. When he betrayed her again, they parted ways for good. She contacted me once more, but I still couldn't face her. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life. Over time, she began dating someone else, but that relationship ended after it turned toxic. She walked away with emotional and physical scars that served as a painful reminder of her choices. One night, I went to a party, and against my better judgment, I drank more than I should have. Somehow, we ended up back together. Things weren't the same, though. I still loved her, but I couldn't fully trust her. No matter how much I tried to rebuild what we had, I couldn't shake the memories of the past. Eventually, we got married, and she moved into my house. It wasn't much, a modest home gifted to me by my grandparents when I graduated college, but it was ours. For a while, it felt like we had found some stability, then everything fell apart. It was Valentine's Day, and I wanted to surprise her. I left work early, bought flowers and a card, and headed home. But as I pulled up to the house, I saw a car parked outside, a car I recognized immediately. It belonged to her ex, Grant. My stomach turned. Instead of pulling into the driveway, I parked down the road and approached quietly. The front door was locked, so I used the spare key we kept hidden and let myself in. The house was silent as I walked through the kitchen and down the hall. The living room was empty, but faint sounds from the bedroom made my heart race. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. There they were, tangled in bed together. I didn't wait or hesitate. The shock and anger surged through me, and I stepped fully into the room. Nora gasped when she saw me, clutching the sheets to cover herself. Grant scrambled to get up, fumbling to grab his clothes. I didn't yell or lash out, but the weight of my presence was enough to fill the room. I stood in silence, watching them try to make sense of the situation. Once Grant was dressed, he glanced at me as if expecting me to step aside and let him leave. I blocked the doorway, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made him freeze. "You're not leaving just yet," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Take her with you. Both of you. Out." Nora began to sob, pleading with me, but I didn't waver. When it all came to a head, I made him pull her out of bed, leaving her no choice but to wear the same clothes she had worn earlier that day. Grant had to all but push her out the door while she screamed at the top of her lungs. Throughout the ordeal, he didn't utter a single word. Despite my anger over the situation, I had to admit that Grant, for all his faults as a womanizer, was generally a personable guy. Unfortunately, my wife found him a bit too likable. Through the window, I watched as he struggled to keep her in the car, practically pinning her down as they drove away. Over the following days, I stayed true to my word. I packed up all her belongings and dumped them unceremoniously on Grant's front lawn. I didn't bother knocking, nor did anyone come out to stop me. I simply emptied the car and drove off. It wasn't until later that I learned she had refused to stay with him. He ended up taking her back to her parents' home, about 60 miles away. Since then, she had been relentlessly trying to contact me, calling the house phone, flooding my cell with messages. Eventually, I'd had enough. I disconnected the landline and changed my cell number. I didn't want to hear her voice or entertain any conversation with her. A few days after I dropped her things off, her parents arrived at my house and she was with them. I refused to let her step foot inside. When her father, Martin, came to the door, I told him plainly that if Nora so much as got out of the car, they'd all have to leave immediately. He must have believed I was serious because he kept her in the vehicle. I saw her through the window, crying uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Martin and Helen came inside to talk. They began by apologizing on her behalf, but I stopped them short. It wasn't their fault, and I made that clear. However, they wanted to know how they could fix things or what could be done to mend the situation. From their reaction, it was clear they never imagined I wouldn't take her back. "There's nothing to fix," I said firmly. Nora's betrayal had cut too deeply, and there was no undoing the damage. As far as I was concerned, the trust was gone, and she was no longer a part of my life. I explained everything to them: the lies, the infidelity, the events leading up to this point. They were stunned, completely unaware of the truth. They had believed Nora was pure and honest when we married. The depth of her deception seemed to hit them harder than I anticipated. Helen tried to plead on her behalf, emphasizing how distraught Nora was. I couldn't help but shake my head at that. "She's not as devastated as I am," I replied. She had made her choices, and I was the one left picking up the pieces of a life I thought we'd build together, one that now no longer existed. As I described the future I had envisioned with her, raising children, growing old side by side, I felt tears welling up. Her parents cried too, but my resolve didn't waver. I told them plainly that Nora needed to move on because I wasn't taking her back. When I mentioned Grant, Helen's expression soured, but I didn't care. Nora had made her choice, and that was all that mattered to me. As they left, they asked me to stay in touch. Worried about Nora's emotional state, it made me question their priorities. Were they really concerned about her after all she'd done? Or did they think I owed her something? A week later, Martin called again, asking if I'd at least speak with her. He explained that she hadn't been eating and seemed on the verge of harming herself. She had already lost weight, and they feared for her health. While I sympathized with their concern, I couldn't bring myself to reach out. I had no energy left for her or her problems. Shortly afterward, I served her with divorce papers. I wasn't out for revenge. All I wanted was what I'd brought into the marriage. I even offered her half of our savings, about $30,000, to avoid any conflict. When Martin called again, this time in tears, he begged me to reconsider. He said Nora had been physically sick upon receiving the papers and had to be hospitalized. But I had made up my mind. Not long after, I decided to leave town. I resigned from my job, handed over power of attorney to my parents, and rented out my house. Then I disappeared. For the next year, I worked on a fishing boat in Alaska, cutting off all contact, even with my parents. The following year, I moved to California to work on a tuna boat, and after that, I returned to Alaska, working in the oil fields for 3 years. During that time, I lived frugally, saving every penny I earned. Thanks to smart investments and opportunities through my employer, I built a modest nest egg. By the time those 5 years were over, I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough to live comfortably. If I stuck to a modest $50,000 annual budget, my investments would continue to grow. I had stakes in oil and natural gas wells, as well as part ownership of a small fleet of tuna boats. The income from those alone provided over $100,000 a year. Life had changed dramatically, and while the scars of betrayal lingered, I found peace in building a life far removed from the one I left behind. While working in Prudhoe Bay, an accident shook me to my core. It was a stark reminder of my own mortality and forced me to confront everything I had been running from. That moment of clarity made me realize I couldn't continue living in isolation forever. So I decided to quit. My parents were completely taken aback when I showed up unannounced on their doorstep one evening. Communication with them had been sparse while I was away. I didn't want reminders of the life I had left behind. But their reaction to my return was heartwarming. They welcomed me with open arms, and the very next morning, my mom had already spread the news to the family. By that afternoon, a big party was in the works. Being back among loved ones felt surreal after so much time away. During the gathering, my parents filled me in on what had happened to Nora after I left. Things had taken a dark turn for her. She had been hospitalized for a while, having stopped eating entirely and even attempting to harm herself. The root of her despair became evident after some tests. She was pregnant. Martin and Helen, her parents, had tried to reach out to mine, hoping that news of the baby would lead to reconciliation. My father, ever practical, asked them to arrange a DNA test before making any assumptions. Once the pregnancy reached a safe stage, the test was conducted, and the results were clear. I wasn't the father. The news devastated Martin and Helen, who had held out hope that the baby might be a chance to repair the damage. Meanwhile, I was informed that the divorce had been finalized. Nora refused to take her half of the savings, leaving it untouched. A few months later, she gave birth to a baby boy with a head full of dark hair, a feature unmistakably inherited from Grant. He stepped up, acknowledged paternity, and eventually married Nora. By the time I returned home, they had been married for nearly 4 years and had 2 more children. They still lived in his old house, where Grant worked a stable job at the local mill. Nora, now a stay-at-home mom, seemed to have found some semblance of happiness, or so my parents believed. To my surprise, Martin and Helen attended the party that day. My parents had invited them, hoping to mend some fences. We spoke civilly, and they mentioned Nora was doing well with her kids, though her marriage to Grant wasn't ideal. His infidelity had persisted, and it had taken a toll. They shared that Nora had suffered several humiliating incidents, including needing treatment for infections caused by Grant's behavior. Yet she chose to stay with him, convinced no one else would want her. It was painful to hear, but I kept my response neutral. Not long after, I ran into Nora at a local deli. I was having coffee and working on some business when I looked up to see her with her 3 children. She seemed startled, but I wasn't angry anymore. Time had dulled those wounds. I invited her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she joined me. Our conversation was polite, though she tried several times to apologize or explain the past. I cut her off gently, telling her I wasn't interested in revisiting it. Eventually, she got the message. As we finished our meals, I paid for hers. Her kids were sweet, especially her oldest boy, who ended up sitting on my knee. At one point, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said softly that he should have been my son, that this was the life she had once imagined for us. I didn't argue, I simply smiled, and said that I, too, had dreamed of a different outcome once. That was enough to send her quickly gathering her things and hurrying out the door. Life, however, has its twists. About a year later, I got married myself, to none other than the tenant renting my house. My parents had suggested I speak to her about moving out, but instead, we struck up a friendship that blossomed into something more. Ivy, a struggling college student, had been managing on a tight budget thanks to my parents' generosity with rent. Our relationship grew naturally, and after a few months of dating, it became clear we had found something real. Ivy had a shy and reserved nature, and when she asked if we could wait until marriage to be intimate, I respected her wishes. After the wedding, we navigated those first awkward moments with patience and care, learning and growing together. Ivy had no idea about my financial situation. To her, I seemed like a regular guy just scraping by, especially since I was still living with my parents. A few months into our marriage, she grew anxious, worrying about our future and what we'd do if I didn't find stable work. That was when I sat her down and explained I had saved enough to support us comfortably. I didn't reveal the full extent of my wealth, but assured her we wouldn't have to worry about money for a long time. She continued searching for a teaching job, though opportunities nearby were scarce. Life with Ivy was simple but fulfilling, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The look on Ivy's face was unforgettable when I casually grabbed a piece of paper, jotted down a number, and turned it face down on the table. She raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. When I told her it was the balance in our checking account, and that I thought it might be enough to get us by for a while, she hesitated before asking if she could see it. I played it up, acting unsure about letting her. After a moment, I slid the paper toward her. She flipped it over and her eyes widened in disbelief. Her reaction was priceless. "You have over $40,000 in your checking account?" she gasped, staring at me like she couldn't believe it. The relief on her face was unmistakable. Even though we lived in a small house, we didn't have a mortgage to worry about. Her car, though modest, was paid off and reliable. As for me, I hadn't yet bought myself a truck or a new car, but that didn't matter. The weight of financial concerns lifted visibly off her shoulders, and we decided to celebrate the freedom that came with not having to worry about money for a while. A week later, I was working in the garden when Ivy called me inside, her voice filled with urgency. I found her standing by the computer, a puzzled look on her face. She had just checked our account and thought there had been a mistake. A $40,000 deposit had appeared overnight. I chuckled, which only confused her further. When I explained that it was an automatic deposit because it was the 1st of July, her confusion turned to shock. I decided it was time to let her in on the full picture. I pulled up our savings account on the computer and told her to take a look while I poured myself a coffee. When I came back, she was frozen in place, her eyes glued to the screen. The number staring back at her was $1.48 million. You have over $1 million? She whispered, still processing what she was seeing. In that account, yes, I said with a grin. And don't forget the $80,000 sitting in our checking account. Her voice was almost a whisper. We're millionaires? Something like that, I replied with a smirk. But wait, there's more. I pulled up another set of accounts and handed the laptop back to her. As she scrolled through the numbers, her eyes welled with tears. Ivy, I said softly, thanks to a great financial advisor and some smart investments, we're worth over $1.5 million just in liquid assets. But that's not the full picture. With stocks, bonds, and other investments, we're sitting on more than $5 million. And that doesn't include the income from the oil wells I invested in, which bring in around $800,000 a year. She stared at me, stunned, as though I'd just revealed I was from another planet. Without a word, she got up and said she needed to go for a walk. I didn't stop her. She needed time to process everything. When she returned, I was back in the garden, tending to some weeds. She sat nearby with her coffee, still quiet, the shock lingering on her face. I set down my tools and sat beside her. You okay? I asked gently. She nodded, but after a pause, I asked if she wanted to use some of the money for a bigger house or a nicer car. She looked at me indignant. Why would we need anything more than what we have? My car is fine and this house is perfect. The only one who needs something is you. You should get a proper truck. Her response made me smile, and later that evening, we went out for dinner to celebrate. That's when we ran into Grant, Nora, and their kids. They were seated across the room, and it was clear they had already noticed us. I wasn't sure if they knew I had remarried, but this was the first time Ivy and I had seen them together in public. Ivy, aware of who Nora was from the stories and pictures, glanced their way briefly but didn't seem fazed. A little while later, she excused herself to use the restroom. When our food arrived and I noticed Nora was also missing from her table, I felt a twinge of unease. I knew Ivy wouldn't cause trouble, but I had a feeling she might want to talk to Nora, perhaps to satisfy her curiosity. When Ivy returned, she looked calm yet satisfied. Nora, however, rejoined her family with tear-streaked cheeks, and Grant gave me a dark, angry glare as they left the restaurant. Nora walked past without saying a word, her tears still flowing. Later, Ivy admitted she had followed Nora to the restroom. In her quiet, composed way, she introduced herself and told Nora she would never truly understand what she had thrown away. Nora had responded softly, saying she knew it every single day. Ivy didn't elaborate on the conversation, and I didn't press her. Nora was my past. Ivy was my future. Over the years, I learned an important truth. Money makes money. The more we had, the more it seemed to grow on its own. Despite our growing wealth, we didn't change our lifestyle much. We stayed in the same house, Ivy kept her reliable old car, and I eventually bought myself a used Chevy truck. Ivy found a teaching job at the local high school, and we settled into a happy, quiet life together. Meanwhile, our investments continued to grow steadily, providing a secure and comfortable future. Over the years, that nearly $5 million quietly multiplied, and today our net worth has grown to almost $20 million. To Ivy and me, though, it's just a number, a figure we occasionally glance at on a computer screen during financial meetings. Other than periodic discussions with our advisor, we live as if we're no different from anyone else. Summers are spent at home in our cozy little house, tending to the garden and enjoying the simple joys of life. We've never felt the need for extravagance, and that simplicity has brought us more happiness than we ever thought possible. My annual $40,000 deposit every July 1st, combined with Ivy's $38,000 teaching salary, has always been more than enough for us. The wealth we've built? We think of it as nothing more than a retirement fund. We did allow ourselves one indulgence. Every Christmas break, we take a month-long vacation to explore a different corner of the world. It's our one luxury, and it's worth every penny. Ivy takes 2 weeks of unpaid leave, but we hardly notice the difference. Over the years, we've walked the beaches of Santorini, cruised through Iceland's fjords, and marveled at the pyramids of Giza. Those adventures broadened our horizons, but no matter where we went, we always felt the same joy returning to our small, welcoming home. Today, however, everything changed in a way we never anticipated. Ivy and I came back from the doctor's office with life-altering news. She's pregnant. The shock hit me first, but it was quickly followed by excitement. Our little house may be modest, but its 3 bedrooms will suit our growing family perfectly. The yard is spacious enough for kids to run around and play, and we've already joked about whether one child will lead to a dozen. This new chapter has inspired us to loosen the reins on our frugality, just a little. Ivy has already set her sights on a new Nissan SUV, and I'm eyeing a Dodge 4X4, 4-door, 1-ton diesel. Both vehicles will be paid for in cash. No loans, no stress. After years of careful saving, it feels rewarding to be able to afford these upgrades without dipping into our investments. Even with this good fortune, we're proud that we haven't let wealth change who we are. As for Nora and Grant, life hasn't been as kind to them. Grant, it seems, couldn't keep himself together, and his bad habits have persisted through the years. The mill job didn't last, and now he's scraping by with odd jobs, barely making ends meet. Nora, meanwhile, has borne the brunt of their struggles. Stress has taken its toll on her health, and their marriage? Far from a happy ending. Grant's infidelity never stopped, and the aftermath has left Nora dealing with one health issue after another, some of them quite serious. I'd like to say I don't feel anything about their situation, but the truth is, a small part of me does. It's not something I dwell on or mention to others. I certainly don't gloat. But when I look at the life Ivy and I have built together and compare it to theirs, I can't help but feel a quiet sense of justice. They say revenge is best served cold, but for me, it's not about doing anything to hurt them. It's about living well, far better than they ever thought I could.